Hi.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good day.
How are you?
I'm very well.
Good, good.
Okay, I think we're about to begin now, and let me introduce the program. Good day, everyone. Good night, good morning, wherever you are. I know we have attendees from all different parts of the world. Let me introduce myself. My name is Gordon Tapper. I'm a former section chief at the United Nations, founder of Give Them a Hand Foundation, president of the United African Congress, and a board member of the African Renaissance and Diaspora Network. These webinars are being sponsored by United African Congress, the International Association of Applied Psychology, Give Them a Hand Foundation, and Black Star News. Now let me welcome viewers and listeners around the world to this, our 5th webinar, which, as the previous 4 did, addresses the topic, the coronavirus in Africa. As you all know, and it's hard to keep up with the daily statistics, but as of today, the global statistics are 8.4 million infected, 451,000 deaths globally. In the United States, we have 2.2 million infections and 119,000 deaths. That was 2 days ago. Many European countries have been beleaguered by the pandemic, with hundreds of thousands infected and many thousands of deaths. Russia and India have large numbers of persons infected. Latin America has become the new epicenter, with the numbers in Brazil, Chile, and Peru skyrocketing. Brazil now has the second highest number of deaths, 46,000, surpassing the previous second highest, which was the United Kingdom, which has 42,000 deaths. Africa, which is the focus of our attention, is a story yet to be written. As I have said before, we don't know if it is a positive or a negative story. We keep hearing of impending doom, but so far Africa is confounding the pundits. Africa has a population of 1.3 billion persons and 54 independent nations. It has a combined total of 260,000 cases and 7,039 deaths. The countries in Africa with the most infections and deaths are, unfortunately, the Rainbow Nation of South Africa, at 80,000 infections and 1,660 deaths, followed by Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana, and Algeria. And at the other end of the scale, we have Lesotho, which has reported 4 infections. Reported, I say. Overall, where Africa is concerned, and where the toll in human lives is concerned, is this good news or bad news, relatively? What does the immediate future hold? And what does the long-term future hold? We hear different reasons why the numbers in Africa are low, ranging from melanin, the color of the skin, the youth and fitness of the people overall, as Africa has the youngest population of any continent, to speedy action by the governments to close borders, to implement shelter-in-place orders, to contact tracing and general cooperation of the people. However, when it comes to the state of the economies of African countries, that I believe is a different story. Africa, which has been struggling economically for decades, long before COVID-19, have found themselves or do find themselves in very dire circumstances. And with a post-COVID future, very uncertain, to say the least. But permit me to digress for a moment and tell you about another pandemic that is affecting some of our countries and generally in many parts of the world. I'm asking my colleague to put up something on the screen. I won't say anything, I want you to read it. Now, this is a very sad situation. It is a pandemic that we must fight with the same commitment and the same vigor with which we are fighting COVID-19. And rest remain assured that we will be hosting a webinar on that exact subject. Anyway, today, the topic of today's webinar is the economic impact of COVID-19 on Africa and post-COVID building a sustainable future. We have 3 speakers here today who are very knowledgeable on the subject, who will not only peek into the future, but will also tell us what we are likely to see and suggest how the countries may cope and secure a stronger and sustainable future. We're most fortunate to have with us today the Senior Policy Advisor to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Chief Trade Negotiator for Ethiopia, Mr. Mamo, Nihretu. Next, we have one of the world's leading economists and development experts, whose counsel is sought by world leaders and organizations, including the United Nations. That's Mr. Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs is also, among the many hats he wears, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University in New York. Lastly, we have Mr. Neil Cole, a South African, who was recommended highly by a Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of South Africa as the best person to speak on planning for a sustainable future. Mr. Cole is the Executive Secretary of an intergovernmental organization, the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative, CABRI, and their mission is to help governments in developing and implementing reforms that lead to more functional public financial management. Now let me explain how this program will run. Each speaker will have the stage for up to 15 minutes, and it can be 10 or 12. No one is forced to go to 15 minutes. This will be followed by a question and answer session with our resident panel of experts. And lastly, if time permits, we will take questions from you, the participants, that you submit in the chat box. And now I will call on our first speaker, Mr. Mamo Nihretu, Senior Policy Advisor to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Before being assigned to his current position with the Prime Minister, Mr. Nihretu had been a senior project manager at the World Bank, leading the World Bank's group work in Ethiopia in the areas of finance and competitiveness and trade. Mr. Nihretu studied leadership and economic development at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University in the United States. He did postgraduate studies in law in the universities of Pretoria and Amsterdam. And he also graduated from Addis Ababa University in law. Mr. Nihretu, the stage is all yours. Please.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for this opportunity. It's an immense pleasure to be part of this conversation. I will not take much time. I will try to finish in 10 minutes. And in my brief remarks, I want to make essentially 3 points. The first is I want to summarize the impact of COVID on our economy, because this session is about the economic impact of COVID on Africa and African economies. And then I will say a few things about the government's response to contain the pandemic and its economic fallout. And finally, I will conclude by emphasizing the need for global cooperation, particularly the need for additional work on debt relief initiatives globally as part of our effort to contain this pandemic. So first, let me just briefly talk about the impact of COVID on our economies. I believe the COVID-19 pandemic is the biggest challenge the world faces in living memory. And I believe we are only beginning to get a handle on the true scope of this crisis. It's global, it is more severe than a recession, and it has more durational impact. And it seems to us it will not be truly over until we discover either a cure or a vaccine. So like any other country, our economy is affected both in a direct and indirect way. And by direct impact, I'm referring to the immediate impact of public health measures on our economy. Public health measures such as social distancing and selective closure of economic activities are aimed at preventing human interactions. And any measure that hinders human interactions will invariably affect economic activities. There is also an indirect impact of the pandemic on our economy, and I will illustrate this point by giving you a few examples. For example, there is a near complete shutdown of the travel and tourism sector. Recently, the World Tourism Organization predicts that the travel industry will see a whopping 80% decline in international arrivals in 2020. And Ethiopia will be no exception. For example, if you come to Addis, most of the hotels here are partially or fully closed because of low occupancy rate. And this will mean that there will be a significant loss to our tourism service export. This naturally will also affect livelihoods of thousands of people who rely on tourism for their earnings. And my fear is that the tourism and travel sector in Africa will not truly will not recover to the pre-pandemic level until we find a vaccine. Second, we are also seeing a significant decline in remittance. In most developing countries, including Ethiopia, remittance are the most important source of foreign currency earnings. And because of the pandemic, there is a significant decline across Africa. And third impact is there will be a direct impact on inflow of foreign direct investment. And if you look at my own country in Ethiopia, the performance of FDI in the past 10 months has declined by 30%. And this is partly explained by the COVID pandemic. So in short, I want to say that because of the pandemic, there will be a massive economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic, and developing countries such as Ethiopia will be uniquely challenged compared to other countries because we have limited physical space to cope with the challenge. So if this is the economic impact, then the next question is, how are we responding to this pandemic, and how are we addressing this pandemic? In simple terms, I would say through national action and international cooperation. Nationally, our government, for example, is taking a number of physical, monetary, and sectoral measures to combat the spread of the virus, to protect jobs, and also to protect the most vulnerable members of society and support firms and banks. In our case, the immediate and the most important and the most impactful measure, I would say, that we took immediately is to increase the health sector spending. This is done mainly through reallocation of spending within the existing budget. Second, we've allocated additional resources to support the most vulnerable members of society and to ensure food security. And this we did essentially by expanding our social safety net programs. The third national measure that we took was on the monetary side, and the National Bank of Ethiopia has provided significant injection into the economy, partly to address the liquidity challenges of banks, and also to make working capital loan available for sectors that are impacted by this pandemic. So these are essentially the measures that we took at the national level. But of course, whatever we do at the national level will not be enough. And precisely because of that, we need international cooperation. As His Excellency Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, says, this painful pandemic is a complex and adaptive challenge. And in a connected and interdependent world, a complex and adaptive challenge cannot be solved by individual countries alone. It can only be addressed through collective action and through global cooperation. Our Prime Minister, naturally, as a follow-up to that, he actively advocated for global cooperation through what he called a 3-point proposal to G20 countries. There he articulated a number of measures that needs to be taken at global level to contain this pandemic in a coordinated fashion. I believe in this regard, the most effective and the quickest way of international cooperation would be to release resources to low-income countries in particular by implementing additional debt relief initiatives. The resource that we free up in this way would go to save lives and livelihoods. I think one should note in this regard that this initiative is not like past debt relief initiative, partly because most of the developing countries borrowed funds on the back of solid economic performance, and nobody foresaw this pandemic. And I think we should note that we have not squandered our resources, and we need these resources right now, essentially to save lives and livelihoods. For example, if you take the case of Ethiopia, we spend close to 50% of our goods exports to service debt. And put differently, our spending on debt services is close to, I would say, 2 times our health sector spending. So in this regard, I think it's very important for the global community to do additional measures to implement debt relief initiatives. I think we should also note that, recently the G20 countries took measures to suspend debt repayment until the end of this year. And we welcome that initiative, but we feel this is not enough, it didn't go far enough, and more needs to be done. At least in our view, the suspension of debt payments should last not just until the end of 2020, but until the pandemic is over. And it should include not just moratorium or freezing, but also debt cancellation to the extent possible. should not just cover bilateral creditors, but also private creditors to the extent possible. So in conclusion, I want to say this, we feel, taking additional measures on debt relief is in the enlightened self-interest of everyone. We need to have the breathing space really to be able to recover our economies and be able to pay back our debts. In conclusion, what I want to say is that we cannot end this pandemic unless we end it in every continent and in every country. We will be truly safe only when everyone is safe. So in that sense, fighting this pandemic is both a shared interest and also a shared responsibility. Thank you so much.
Gordon, you're on mute.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, Honorable Nihretu. Thank you for your highly informative presentation. It's undeniably that Ethiopia has some problems at the moment. But we must remember that decades ago, the world community had to be coming to the assistance of Ethiopia as a result of famines, etc. Today, Ethiopia provides most of its food, and we don't have to do that again. That's quite a bit of progress that has been made. I would have wanted to hear you talk a bit about the home-ground economic reform program that was instituted in your country in January to unlock the developmental potentials of the country. But perhaps during the Q&A, we can get to that. With that, I will now bring up our next speaker, and he will be Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's someone that the New York Times once wrote about as probably the most important economist in the world, and by Time magazine as the world's best known economist. If you don't have those articles, I will send them to you, Professor Sachs. He has been an advisor to Secretary Generals Kofi Annan and to Ban Ki-moon, and before that. He is an original thinker and a visionary. Professor Sachs, the stage is yours.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for the honor to be with you, and also for the opportunity to follow the Honorable Mamo Nihretu, who made wonderful comments. And I would like to be in touch with you, Mr. Nihretu, about your debt proposals. They are absolutely on track and very practical. And I think practicable also. I don't think we're going to find profound resistance to this very straightforward reality. But they do need to be put in place, and I'd be very happy to help you to do that within the UN leadership, at the IMF, with the G20. I think that it's absolutely correct and called for. I also want to applaud Ethiopia for giving us the leadership of the World Health Organization and Dr. Tedros's excellent work. The World Health Organization is doing a very powerful and very positive contribution to fighting this pandemic. And it's doing it in the face of outlandish and outrageous accusations by the US government, which are nothing but political propaganda for the sake of domestic US politics. So we should not in any way lose sight of Dr. Tedros's great leadership at WHO, just as he was a great Minister of Health and Foreign Minister of Ethiopia, and we're very proud of him and need to give him all the support. He needs it right now. He's under attack from scurrilous political forces in the United States that we're fighting every day. Just be sure of that. And right now, the American people are opening their eyes to the realities of how miserable our government is. After all, the US president has overseen 120,000 deaths through incompetence, lies, vulgarity. But I'm not here to talk about US politics, but I just want to mention that bad governance anywhere, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, it is so destructive, and that's what we have in the United States right now. Now, I think as our leader and moderator has said, the stakes in Africa are extremely high at this moment because the epidemic has not broken out in full force. It has been contained. It arrived a bit late, thank goodness, and governments took strong measures. But this is a very, very stealthy virus. It definitely transmits through infectious individuals that have only mild symptoms or no symptoms at all. So it's possible to spread rapidly. And one can have a few cases in one moment, and then 4 or 5 weeks later, thousands or tens of thousands of cases. And this is the experience of governments that let down their guard or laugh at the virus. In Brazil, another terribly governed country right now, where President Bolsonaro follows in the Trump mold, they basically laughed at the epidemic for weeks, did not take precautions, and now Brazil has perhaps the worst epidemic in the entire world. And it's largely due to one person, the president, and his irresponsibility. But it means you cannot relent from focus on control of the virus. If you take a worldwide panorama, the Asia-Pacific countries are really important examples for us and important for Africa. Because in the Asia-Pacific, including China, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a very important case, Vietnam, because it's a low-income country that has had no deaths from COVID. All of the Asia-Pacific has been able to suppress the virus. How are they doing it? They're doing it basically through public health rather than through lockdowns. Of course, what they have stopped are huge public events that could spread the virus dramatically. So be careful. Do not have people filling stadiums. Do not have mass crowds of people celebrating or at political rallies and so forth, like our stupid president wants to have in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the next couple of days. Don't do this. But in addition, what the Asian countries are doing is people are observing basic hygiene. They have face masks. They're keeping a physical distance. If they have any symptoms, they are reporting them. The governments are helping people to isolate, to quarantine in public facilities if necessary. And they are taking care, which is really important, of all of the places of congregate settings where people are living together in very crowded conditions, like an elder care center or a prison or a worker hostel, where there's crowds of people, because then the virus can just spread like crazy. So the name of the game is not lockdowns. The name of the game is precaution against transmission of the virus. And to do that, face masks everywhere. It's not our tradition in Africa or the United States, but we need to do it now. And these masks need to be available massively everywhere. This is part of what financing should do. They should be handed out any place, and people should know that's safety. That's how to stop becoming infected and how to prevent infecting others. Keeping a physical distance, avoiding these large super spreader events, and then using the African know-how of community health workers for contact tracing and helping infectious people to get tested quickly, to isolate, and to trace their contacts. And throughout Africa, there's a lot of experience in this. In Ethiopia, with the CHUs, the community health extension workers, for example, that Dr. Tedros pioneered. We need to use this cadre with the right protective gear, with their own face masks and so forth, to be reporting potential outbreaks anywhere and helping infectious people to find a safe harbor in a public facility so that they don't infect their family members, their workplace colleagues, and so on. And what Vietnam has shown and what the Asia Pacific countries have shown is you need a lot of diligence in this. It's not easy, but it is not just a lockdown. It's much better than a lockdown because people can actually go about their lives to a major extent, but doing so with a tremendous amount of precaution and a tremendous amount of government support. The reason we have 120,000 deaths in the United States, by the way, is that our government is completely dysfunctional, starting with the president. There's no concept of the most basic orientation to public health. We don't have national contact tracing. We don't have quarantine facilities in most of the countries. We don't have the use of face masks. In fact, Trump ridiculed using face masks, sending a signal to his supporters that that's, you know, only for the left wing. It's crazy. It's just crazy what a bad leader can do. So what we really need to do is enforce rigorous public health standards. And what I would really strongly advise of the African leadership is make sure that your top public health experts are talking every day together by Zoom. They're having regional meetings talking about where are the outbreaks, what are the problems, what are the bottlenecks, what needs to be overcome, where do we need new solutions, where are there not enough test kits, where isn't there PPE available, very practical things. And I think that with this, the epidemic can be controlled. Now, just a moment about the next steps. I've used up all my time on fighting the epidemic because I think that's the only economics that counts right now, is stopping this virus. Because if the virus is not stopped, the economy will not function and people will suffer. But Africa can control the epidemic, thank goodness. As Gordon said, a young population, that's a big advantage. Community health workers, that's a big advantage. Later arrival of the vaccine, strong leadership in many countries that can be brought to bear to help the public to accomplish these basic goals. Now, what to do then? Part of it is financing, and that's why I really want to connect with the Honorable Mr. Nihretu, because his ideas are exactly right. We need to get a financial framework for African recovery. I would also put an emphasis on using the new phase of recovery to build infrastructure, renewable energy, information technology, all the things that Africa wants to do and has plans to do in PIDA, through NEPAD, and link this up with the initiatives that are going to be underway in Europe, in China, in Korea, in Japan, to say Africa's recovery plan is a continental-wide recovery plan. It involves investments in clean energy, in information technology, in new infrastructure, and to partner between the AU and the EU, between the AU and China, between the AU and Japan and Korea, to reinforce and strengthen those partnerships. There's going to be a lot of opportunity for that. So I'll just end here. I know time is short, but Africa absolutely can overcome this crisis. But we should note how all of the Americas now are in terrible crisis. It doesn't spare poor countries. It doesn't spare developing countries. It doesn't spare young populations. All of South America is enmeshed in this, but that is because of the lack of cooperation and the terrible leadership of Trump, of Bolsonaro, and others. So good leadership, excellent public health, and global partnership, and Africa can show the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. I think most of us here today will agree with what you have said so far, and of course, we agree with what Mamo Nihretu has said. Mostly the same sort of things as in terms of the solution, and the world needs to develop a coherent plan, not to just benefit one area, the West or Europe, but the entire world, because we are interconnected. And very surprisingly, we here in the West found out that we were so interconnected with China, for instance, Vietnam, other producers, that we suddenly realized, oh my, we need to be very careful. We need to create better and stronger bonds and not just separate ourselves from other people. But Professor Sachs, you did say something some time ago that really resonated with me. And I think it perhaps gets to the crux of the matter in wealthy countries. And where you said, wealth should create well-being. It's really a very simple statement, but a very profound statement. You have a country that has the highest per capita income in the world, and at the same time, millions living in poverty, millions sleeping on the sidewalk. It is quite distressing. Thank you. I am pretty sure that there will be questions that you will have to be responding to, and of course, Honorable Nihretu. Our final speaker, before we get to the Q&A, is Mr. Neil Cole from the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative, CABRI. I don't want to disturb his presentation, but perhaps he can tell us a bit more about CABRI, perhaps now or during the Q&A. Yesterday, we had a briefing with the speakers, and we found Neil to be very knowledgeable about how governments can get the most out of their budgets and how to spur growth. He was also quite engaging, as I'm sure you will find out yourself. Neil, the microphone is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Gordon, and it's a true privilege to be part of this esteemed panel, and also the many experts that you have gathered. So as you said, I'm the Executive Secretary of CABRI. It is an intergovernmental organization that works with mainly ministries of finance across Africa. So my presentation is going to strongly take the perspective of a Ministry of Finance and share some of the challenges that a Ministry of Finance is faced with, and by extension, the challenge that governments are faced with in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think I'd like to start by just recognizing that governments are frequently confronted with these changing circumstances. And these changing circumstances disrupt even the best prepared plans. Some are routine pressures, and these require more than regular adjustments to plans, while others do become chronic and have a greater impact on the economy and on public finances. And I'll certainly cover some of those shocks that countries have experienced. I think what we need to recognize is that COVID-19 has and is causing an extraordinary financial shock, and I suppose by extension, a budgetary shock for many countries. To a different degree, many countries across Africa have been here before. If we think of the political crisis in the Central African Republic that had a tremendous impact on just the governance of the country, economic growth in the country, and the delivery of crucial services across the country. Social demands such as the recent no fees for tertiary education in South Africa also took South Africa into an extraordinary crisis. I think the one that probably comes the closest to the COVID-19 pandemic at a national level would be the Ebola epidemic in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. And if we remember the steps that those countries needed to take with lockdowns, closing their borders, stopping of flights in and out of the countries, the impact on economic growth, and the type of responses that were required to shift resources to address the Ebola crisis in those countries. So let's look at how extraordinary the current crisis is, and the extraordinary pressure that COVID-19 has placed on African governments and governments certainly across the world. And these are some of the obvious ones and the ones that are well known. That's the impact on trade links, especially the trade links with trade partners in countries and continents that have been badly affected, Europe, the United States, etc. The decline in remittances from the African diaspora has been massive. Drop in FDI and ODA. And I think the ODA numbers are not yet fully seen, but there's a prediction that ODA is certainly going to be heavily hit. Domestic financial markets tightening, loss of revenue, the need for an increase in public expenditure to safeguard human health has meant that several investments, especially capital investments, have had to be put on hold. And then also disruptions to local agri-food supply chains. The challenges that countries now have, and Professor Sachs touched on this, Mamo also touched on this, is just the massive financing requirements. I mean, there's a number that has been put out by the World Bank and the IMF that estimates that around 114 billion will be required in 2020 to fight COVID-19. Countries are having to adjust their appropriated expenditure, as I mentioned, where they're finding that they have to reallocate funding to respond to COVID-19, and having to communicate that trade-off not only within the political party, but in legislators and also across the country. We are seeing an increase in short-term borrowing. The challenge obviously being that this should not be compromising on debt sustainability, and we'll certainly align with the call that has been made by Prime Minister Abiy for debt relief. Seeing countries tapping into their contingency reserves, but in most cases, these have been inadequate in terms of their provision. Challenge obviously being that a good PFM system should be assisting and not hindering the emergency service delivery. We are seeing many countries waiving some of their procurement regulations in order to get provisions to the front line much faster. There's also increasing resources from existing tax bases, domestic resource mobilization, has taken a back seat. And then there's the balancing of flexibility with transparency and accountability. So how are all these additional funds that are now being programmed to be spent much faster, how are they being accounted for, is also a very important challenge. Just on what is to be done. So given the limited room for fiscal maneuver or fiscal space, it is essential that governments act decisively and pragmatically. And I would certainly align with all the points that have been made by Professor Sachs in terms of leadership, in terms of good governance. And we are certainly seeing evidence of both innovation and also decisive leadership on the continent. Some of it under the presidency that South Africa currently holds of the African Union, where President Ramaphosa has convened Zoom meetings, remote meetings with other heads of state for precisely the reasons that have been outlined by Professor Sachs in order to improve cooperation. How are we responding? And I just want to list the measures that a few countries have taken. So we've seen in Benin, Comoros, Eswatini, Guinea, and Mozambique, the establishment of COVID-19 resource allocation committees. And what this essentially is to improve coordination within government. We've also seen cases where the health ministry and finance ministry have moved into common space so that they can improve on coordination, so that they can improve on the costing and the procurement of provisions. Many countries have instituted streamlined procurement processes. We've certainly seen that. Countries like Zambia and Rwanda have ensured treasury continuity by enabling officials to work remotely. Quite interesting to see that Ghana and Algeria, the Mamo region, suspending their fiscal rules that they had in place. And this is so that additional spending can take place and take place in order to save lives. And then we've also seen in Benin them putting in place a new digital system that helps with the registration of new businesses and also just make it easier for commerce during very difficult times. CABRI has responded in support of ministries of finance and African governments, mainly focusing on ways to manage this budget crisis, taking some lessons from how the three countries responded to the Ebola crisis. We've been focusing on issues around efficiency. We've also had a webinar that built on work we were doing on health financing to look at ways to improve strategic health purchasing. And certainly going forward, we want to improve on the dialogue between African debt managers, and maybe this would be a way to also feed into some of the initiatives that has been led by Prime Minister Abiy. So thank you very much. I do encourage you to visit our website and also our other social media platforms. Thank you very much, Gordon.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you for your efforts in working with governments in using their budgets, establishing budgets and using it more productively and economizing to the best possible extent. I think that is fantastic. You have pointed out that there is very little room, little space to maneuver, and that is a fact. Not a penny can be wasted. And of course, as we've heard from Professor Sachs and from Honorable Nihretu, we need the world, the West, the financial institutions to come together as well. Debt cancellation is something that I think should be clearly should be on the table. And I remember, I don't know who amongst us here will recall the 70s and the 80s when Prime Minister Michael Manley spoke about a new world economic order. I think that is something that we need today. The relationship between the developing countries, donor countries, and recipient, I think something has to change there. We cannot go around, we cannot have 50% of your GDP used to service debts. It is not sustainable. And that needs to be addressed. I should mention that I'm very delighted that Professor Sachs mentioned Dr. Tedros. And he is someone that there are a few of us here who has supported when he was nominated and put forward. And we wrote letters on his behalf, myself, Dr. Noor Hussein, Militon Alimani, Dr. Judy, and we coordinated with Ambassador Takeda Alemu, who was the ambassador at the time, and we strongly supported him, and we still support him today. Anyway, we are now moving into the second part of our program, which is the question and answers with the panel of experts. And our resident panel of experts will include Dr. Mohammed Noor Hussein. He's chairman of the United African Congress, professor of medicine emeritus, and former chief of geriatrics at the State University of New York Downstate Medical Center. Dr. Julie Kurliansky, United Nations main representative of the International Association of Applied Psychology, professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology at Columbia University Teachers College, trustee of the United African Congress. Mr. Militon Alimadi, a Ugandan by birth, adjunct professor of African history at John Jay College, a Pan-Africanist, human rights activist, and publisher of the Black Star News. Ms. Stephanie Evans, director of education and associate professor at the Harlem Hospital, New York City. She's the director of Give Them a Hand Foundation. Today, we also have two guests on this panel of experts. They are Mr. Ben Dotse Malor. He's currently chief editor in the United Nations News and Media Division. Prior to that, he was head of communications for the former president of Ghana, Mr. John Mahama. He was also the BBC Africa correspondent for 8 years. We also have, as guest panelist, Mr. Stephen Mwara. He's an international consultant with broad expertise over 25 years in digital financial services. He previously headed a division in the Central Bank of Kenya. And he's a frequent speaker at events and conferences hosted by the World Bank. He's a graduate of Syracuse University and coincidentally attended the university at the same time at the person who's on the screen right next to him, Militon Alimadi. And with that, I will turn to Mr. Militon Alimadi, and I will give him the opportunity to pose the first question to the speaker. Militon.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to all the speakers for their presentations on this very critical topic. This is, first of all, I have a question for each one of these speakers, but I also have one for all of them. A part of the problem is that African countries' economies were generally chronically weak anyway. So could each one of them comment on the need to create production and productivity, to increase industrialization, and have more domestic as well as regionally integrated economic systems where we have more value-added production, whether it's agriculture or in an industry. So that's for any one of them. But then specific questions. My first question is for Mr. Nihretu. And I read the op-ed by Prime Minister Abiy in terms of the proposal for debt cancellation. In addition to that, would it not be helpful if all African countries actually came together and signed on collectively to make such a demand? Would that not increase the potential and perhaps exert a little more pressure in terms of just having Ethiopia be the only voice that seems to be pushing that proposal at this time? And then my question to Professor Sachs, implicit in your suggestion that African countries take a more careful look at the Asian Pacific countries, countries like Vietnam, for example, are you suggesting that in fact African countries abandon the current strict lockdown regimes that they have and embrace what some country like Vietnam is doing, provided mass gatherings are, of course, still avoided? And are you also suggesting that it is because of the strict lockdown regime that in fact is the reason why the economic impact of COVID has been worse than it should have been in African countries? And then this is a comment also directed to Professor Sachs. The issue of face masks, which you mentioned, I agree with you. It's critical. And I recently saw this very sad video posted by a woman in a rural area in Uganda saying she went to the market in the rural area to buy food, but then they would not allow her to enter the market unless she bought a face mask. And she had to spend, I think it was a quarter of the money she had to purchase a face mask in order to enter the market, meaning she could only buy less food after she made that purchase. Is there a way to mobilize, maybe between the three of you gentlemen and other contacts you have, to get financing to provide free face masks to everybody that needs it in African countries? And then my question to Mr. Neil Cole is actually, could you respond to Professor Sachs' suggestion that perhaps the strict lockdown regime is not the best approach? Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, my friend Milton, I think you asked about 8 or 10 questions there, but I will allow the Professor Sachs, Neil, and Honorable Nihretu to respond. I want to remind everyone that time is of essence, and there are other persons who will be asking questions. So if we could do it as briefly as possible. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Maybe I will respond to those excellent questions, and then I'm going to have to beg forgiveness that I have actually a call at 1 o'clock that I'm going to have to take on my part. So, Dr. Alimadi, you asked about long-term growth strategy, which is extremely important. It's a long topic, but yes, Africa needs an AU-wide strategy, especially for building energy, infrastructure, and mass education and access to healthcare for everybody. And the Sustainable Development Goals provide the overarching useful framework for that. There are a lot of very exciting projects on the table right now. I'm working with a number of leaders, Mr. Raila Odinga and others, who are helping to lead on the infrastructure side on projects like Inga Falls, which is a mega energy development project, of course, on the Congo River Basin, 50 gigawatts, that would have a very big effect on empowering long-term development. In general, I'm a believer in using the digital revolution, using Africa's vast renewable energy, and educating every child as the absolute core of the agenda going forward, and then creating the fiscal framework in order to achieve those objectives. On the question of the lockdown and so on, there's going to have to be, of course, as I emphasized, a partial restriction, especially on large gatherings, super spreader events, and so on. Nobody's figured out how to get around that, even the East Asian, the Asian Pacific countries. Meeting in large groups is just so dangerous with this epidemic. And it turns out a very large proportion of the spread of the infection is actually in super spreader events. So part of the lockdown has to continue, but not the shops and the daily life, which takes such a heavy toll on people who need to meet their livelihoods and actually get their food for the day and so on. But you can't just lift the lockdown. It has to be replaced by the public health intensive control. So it is a substitution that I'm arguing for, not simply an elimination. Some countries have said the lockdown's too painful, we just throw open the economy again. Pakistan is an example of that. The prime minister admitted we can't control it, we can't keep the lockdown, but now there's very difficult conditions of spreading infection. So the idea is release the lockdown because the contact tracing, the quarantining, the very strict observance of face mask use and so forth is in place. Finally, on the question of face masks, they ought to be handed out in every market for free, anywhere. This should be the prize token no matter where you are. And this is such low cost compared to the returns. For 20 years ago, I spent years and years and years saying, just give away bed nets to everybody and make sure that everybody has access to all the other life-saving medical supports. A face mask. For sure, that woman in the marketplace should just be given the face mask. She should be given 10 of them. Madam, wear these at home. Give them to your children. Have the rest of your family use them. So I would be delighted to work with Neil and Mr. Nihretu on the mass financing of this. Indeed, production in the African context also. But we should absolutely have the mass blanketing of this because it is the lowest cost, most effective solution, and nobody should have to pay for it. By the way, every day I say this in New York City the same way. So, a pretty rich part of the world, give them away everywhere. And so let's work on that. It's very practical. It turns out in the data, it is the single most powerful intervention we can find.
Before you leave, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. Before you leave, and I'm sorry, Milton, I have to jump in at the moment because I know
I'm done. I'm done. Thank you.
I know Dr. Trudy has a question for Professor Sachs and would like her to ask it because it is relevant to what he's just said before he leaves.
I'm going to purposely shift where I was going to say about wealth and wellness, which I know you can answer, Jeffrey, because of your whole issue about the World Happiness Report. But more importantly and urgently, I want you and everyone to know we need to work with you because we are now working on a project of creating entrepreneurship in the Congo, having women, paying women to make masks that will be distributed for free.
Yes.
And adding to that, Jeffrey, washing stations that people will also get infographics about health education and psychosocial support. So we need to work on that. We are totally, as the UAC and IAP, on board with you about that.
Count me in. I'm here, ready to work. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. We'll continue the discussion, and congratulations for bringing together everybody.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Okay. Okay, Milton, were your questions all responded to?
Gordon, if I could,
by Professor Sachs,
all right.
But I had questions for the other two also. So.
If I could come in, I mean, maybe first one of those positive developments that COVID-19 stifled, and that was the formation of the Africa Free Trade Area. And let's hope that as countries come out of the lockdown and economies open and border restrictions are lifted, that the African continent moves with speed. Because I think a continent where we have small economies, we're going to need to rely on each other increasingly. And certainly the Africa Free Trade Area is one of those developments that can certainly boost trade, boost intra-Africa trade in a way that can also contribute towards more productive capacity in manufacturing. So I think definitely a very positive development was the formation of the Africa Free Trade Area.
I agree.
You know, Moulton, there was something that struck me that Professor Sachs says, which comes back to your question on whether the right approach was the hard lockdowns, and that is that Professor Sachs said that the name of the game is not the hard lockdowns or lockdowns. The name of the game is taking precautions against the infections. And I think that is maybe where we got the emphasis wrong. And if I look at my own country, South Africa, we're emphasizing the lockdown and not emphasizing enough some of those public health measures that need to be taken. So now that we are slowly lifting the lockdown, we're now in what is called level 3. And most sectors of our economy are open. But when you go out, you see people not wearing masks. You see people not social distancing. And I wonder if that emphasis was wrong when we were in lockdown. We kept everybody in lockdown in order to keep people apart. But as soon as the economy opened again, people forgot about the 3 basic or 4 basic things: face mask, social distance, wash hands, and just sanitize the crap out of everything, right? The President Ramaphosa was saying today that we can't stay in lockdown forever. What the lockdown did help to do was to give countries more time to prepare their health system. So more emergency beds have been added, more ventilators have been purchased. And when our expected peak does hit us, we'll be better prepared. And maybe the hard lockdown did help us to get better prepared. But I think that we need to once again bring back the message of the basics. And I think that is what Professor Sachs is essentially saying, and that's certainly what I would align with.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Nihretu, to pose the question that he has. I know he has a question, and I know he has something that he wanted to say. And then I will go to Ben Malor to pose his question, and then to Stephen. Dr. Nihretu.
Thank you, Gordon. I have just one question, and I think Mr. Nihretu or perhaps Neil can answer that. Obviously, the economic model that we've been following up to now has been found woefully inadequate to deal with emergencies like what we are having now. Obviously, it's not going to be business as usual after this pandemic is over. Can you suggest what the future economic model would look like? You cannot be repeating the same mistakes again, model of development. That's about the question that I have.
Okay. Who did you pose it to?
Mr. Nihretu can take us out.
Very good, very good.
Thank you for the question. I didn't, for a moment, my internet, got disconnected and I didn't hear the initial round of questions. But I think that's a very, very important question, Dr. Mohammed. I think the first thing that I would say is we are all learning, right? I mean, there are a lot of unknowns. Hello? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. We're
Yes,
hearing you.
there are a lot of unknowns that we are continuously learning about. But given what we know, I would say there are about 3 or 4 things that we need to focus on. I think the first thing is to effectively address our economic recovery. We need to first address the health crisis. I mean, this is the point that Professor Sachs also was referring to. I think an effective public health plan is an important component of the economic recovery plan. So I think we have to do more in that regard. Another important learning is going forward, we have to pay more attention on social services and particularly public health. So public health spending has to increase in the post-pandemic world in most developing countries. Now, another important learning for us is we also need to scale up our investment in the so-called gig economy, kind of digital economy, because what we see, after this pandemic is, quick expansion and scaling up of use of technology. So I think we need to do more in that regard. And finally, a very important agenda for the state in the post-pandemic world is the need to pay particular attention to safety net measures. So we need to do more in terms of protecting the most vulnerable members of the society. So safety net programs need to be significantly strengthened. They need to be significantly expanded. So all this to say, in the post-pandemic world, the role of the state would be even more significant. I think the state needs to play an active role, a smart role, in terms of not only containing the fallout from the pandemic, but also, in creating a resilient economy going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Gordon?
Good question, Dr. Hussein.
Yeah,
Good
I just
response.
want to let Mr. Nihretu and the rest of the audience know that I'm proud of being a member of the Ethio-American Doctors Group. I sit on the board of directors. We are a group of 350 plus health professionals that have come together to build an economically sustainable center of excellence in Addis Ababa, hospital in Addis Ababa. And we hope to be able to deliver internationally accredited quality of care, standard of care, and also become a catalyst for change at home, in Ethiopia, in the region, and in Africa. So this is the kind of the schematic representation of the hospital we are building. We have already built the foundation, and now that Ethiopian rainy season is over, actually coming rather, we will not be able to start any building of the superstructure, plus under the current pandemic conditions also may be delayed, but we are ready to get the superstructure up and running. I would stop there because in the limited time that we have. I just want to, one thing, Gordon, I think we should stay away from the idea of a donor and recipient country. Nobody is giving and nobody is receiving. We are also asking for, this is an imbalance in the economic order that has created this mess. So it should be more of an equitable economic system in the world. So it's not necessarily, waiting for handouts or something.
Right.
All right.
I agree with you on that. I agree with you on that. Okay, thank you very much. Ben, your turn to pose your question.
Thank you very much, Gordon, and many thanks to the speakers. Mr. Nihretu, we want Ethiopia to succeed and be an example to the rest of the continent. As a Pan-Africanist, like my brother Milton, we want what works well in Ethiopia to be, in a way, replicated everywhere. We believe that I am of the strong conviction a united Africa and having unity on certain key issues will benefit the continent much, much better than going it alone by ourselves. which then leads me to my first question to the panel, to Mr. Nihretu, and also to Neil in Pretoria. Does China owe Africa a moral duty, especially where we are thinking of debt cancellation? Considering what is happening now, should China in particular be doing more? A lot of African nations are owing China in a big way. Does China owe, if not the whole world, at least Africa, especially where the economies are crashing, poor health systems are suffering? Should China do something extraordinary to help Africa or African nations beyond what they would say they are doing already? And then my second question is, how vital are the Sustainable Development Goals now as the way to lift all of us forward into the new normal? How can we deploy the Sustainable Development Goals? UN Secretary General Guterres is saying we shouldn't return to the world as it was before COVID-19. Can we use this crisis as an opportunity to refashion a better way out, a greener way out, a cleaner way out, whereby there is a more equitable upliftment of lives across the world? These are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. We should have invited you to be a speaker. I like your question. Okay, and who will respond to that?
Maybe I don't mind starting, and then Mamo can come in. So let me tackle the China question. Look, I mean, undoubtedly, the investments that China has made in Africa has, on the whole, been very beneficial to Africa. Certainly in the area of infrastructure. I think some of those investments, and I think it gets into lots of complexity, some of those investments, especially where it's taken the form of loans, have contributed towards unsustainable debt for many African countries. And I think we see the examples in Zambia, also in Kenya, and there's some certainly warning signs in Ethiopia if one looks at it purely from a public finance perspective and looking at debt to GDP ratios and how the servicing of some of that debt is now starting to crowd out priority spending, whether it is in health or education, etc. So China certainly, I mean, if there is going to be a serious dialogue around a table to look at debt relief in Africa, China would certainly have to be at that table. We never thought that we would get to a point where we would require another multilateral debt relief initiative as we had in the early part of the 2000s. But here we are, and I think it is an important initiative that needs to be undertaken, and all of Africa and African countries, partners, whether it's finance partners or any other partners, would certainly need to be sitting around that table. But I do want to conclude this point by saying that when we had the multilateral debt relief initiative, that we failed to put in place the capability to manage new debt that we were invariably going to incur. And we very quickly got ourselves into that same situation again. So I do want to encourage that when we enter into these negotiations, that countries ensure that we put in place, African countries ensure that we put in place a debt management capability so that we don't repeat the mistake that landed us into debt unsustainability that several countries entered the pandemic with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mamo, do you want to take a shot at that too?
Can I just add one
Yes.
point,
Right.
just building on what Neil said?
Of course.
I think the first thing to note is, most of the African countries have excellent relationship with China. And China is an important development partner. China is a source of development finance. China is an important export market. And China is predominantly an important source of foreign direct investment for most African countries. And I think this is very important to acknowledge the partnership and the support of the Chinese government and the Chinese people to support the development effort of most African countries. And I think it's critical that African countries continue to access external source of finance to accelerate their own development effort. I think in most countries, this is exactly what happened. But having said that, the current debt relief initiative that most African countries are advocating is not like before. The difference is, this is because of a very unusual circumstance. This is because of unprecedented pandemic, which we are unable to foresee, and nobody was able to foresee this before. And it's very important for most African countries to focus on health spending at this particular point in time. And this is a point that was emphasized by Professor Sachs as well. So for lives and livelihoods is the most important and urgent priority at this particular point in time. And until we succeed in this task, it's only natural that we seek the partnership and the support of our development partners, including China. And by the way, there is an excellent discussion, an excellent partnership between the Chinese government and most African governments. And just one final point in this regard is, it's also critical for African governments to be able to manage, select, prioritize, and execute their public projects successfully so that they become productive and generate resources to be able to pay back the debt. So this should not be confused with past multilateral debt relief initiative. This is unprecedented. We are seeking this because of the pandemic. And I just want to emphasize that point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ben, you're okay? Good. All right, now we're going to move to Stephen and give him an opportunity to ask his question.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, everybody, and especially the great speakers who have given us a very good brief on what is happening. I want to ask two questions. The first one, I will address it to Mamo, and I refer to what he said about the vulnerable. And I want to ask the question whether the vulnerable are the traditional rural poor or urban poor. And when I listen to what he was saying, I want to observe that if you look at the tourist sector, which has definitely collapsed, you then ask yourself, are the persons who have been employed by such a sector, including pilots of airplanes, considered to be vulnerable to the extent that their incomes have dried up completely? And if that be the case, have governments addressed themselves to this new class of vulnerables? Having asked that question about the vulnerables whose jobs have really dried up, I want to then ask the question of the urban poor. And when you look at what is happening in Africa, you find, especially in our countries, it is the slums. Like I look at the numbers in Nairobi, it is the slums where the pandemic is becoming uncontrollable. And when you address the persons who live in those slums, they are generally persons who are employed to do cash jobs in the cities. And when you try to lock them down, you find that they actually cannot live under those circumstances. At the same time, looking at what Professor Sachs was saying, they tend to live together as communities who live very close to one another. And the spread of COVID-19 amongst them is actually part of their life. And I'm asking whether a new program can be thought out as to how we can employ those urban poor who live in slums and look for a way of containing them there and managing them to the extent that they don't extend the growth of the pandemic. If actually you look at the statistics, the rural areas do not seem to be affected heavily by this disease so far, especially when partial lockdowns have been put in place. But the slums, what we call the Kiberas of Kenya, or the Madhares of Kenya, are the ones I think we need to think about and come up with a solution, especially in Africa. And I believe if we did this in good time, we will stop the spread as we are seeing it in Latin America. This is the question then I want to take to Neil. And this is a question that is bothering me more than any other, in the sense that traditionally, central banks and governments have been dealing with the topic of stability. But then you have a combination of issues of if a country is dependent on oil is not giving us anything. Tourism is also not a sector which is also dead. Remittances are basically, again, really badly affected. So when you speak about extraordinary circumstances, I want to ask whether the current Bretton Woods institutions are set up. Are they really providing the right solutions in extending debt to such a country? If a country's tourism, oil sector, and remittances have dried up, what would giving them credit by a World Bank, what would it mean to the currencies of such economies? Are we actually delaying or planting seeds for the collapse of our currencies? And when these currencies collapse, will we then not be in one situation? Can we then think about a situation where we are not talking about debt, whether you are talking debt relief, or whether you are talking about debt in any sense? Can't we look for a plan through which these economies can be supported without necessarily talking about debt? And in any case, are the Bretton Woods institutions doing the right things? Compared this to the first world or developed economies, we hear them talk about monetary easing. We hear them provide money to the private sector. Now here we are already talking about debt. Are we in Africa really addressing the issue of post-COVID and how it's going to affect us? May I come back to Mamo and ask him another question with regard to use of cash, use of notes and coins. What the World Health Organization did indicate that the transmission can also be made worse by use of notes and coins. And we are asking ourselves in cases like Ethiopia, how much are they doing to facilitate use of documents like mobile money or digital type of currencies to mitigate the risk of transmission through the use of notes and coins. And finally, for Mamo again, Dr. Sachs, Professor Sachs was really busy talking about the differences between Africa and the countries of Southeast Asia or Asia. But do we realize that we have a behavior problem that we need to address? Because I observe in our neighborhoods that somebody could be having a mask and not use it at all. And they are just walking around with a mask hanging on the neck and not using the mask, and therefore not really using it. And in that case, if we give the masks for free, you know what happens when goods are given for free. The utility or the usage is abused. So I was wondering whether if the masks that we are buying are being abused and they are not being used, whether we really need to do a bit on the side of education and looking at how we can change the cultures for us to appreciate that this pandemic is not one of those normal situations. So I would want to stop there and hope that you can tell me something about what will happen to the economies when we just continue heaping debt on.
Thank you, Stephen. A beautiful multi-part question you have posed to our speakers. And who will take a shot at that? And I know you've mentioned Mamo and you've mentioned Neil. So let's sort it out. Who goes first?
I don't mind coming in and maybe just touching on the issue of urban informal settlements.
Remember, time is of the essence now.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that if one thinks about the lockdown and lockdown measures, in many respects, it is a best practice and maybe the only practice. And certainly the advice that has been provided by the WHO. And in implementing that best practice of the lockdowns, I don't think that we applied enough thought to how this best practice was going to be implemented in informal settlements, where social distancing, as you say, it's virtually impossible. And maybe just the socialization works against this whole idea of social distancing. In the initial stages, there was an attempt to physically break down some informal settlements to alleviate the congestion in certain informal settlements. But that obviously had a backlash, and government had to backtrack from that. So I certainly don't have the answers. Suffice to say that maybe we took a best practice and did not give sufficient thought to our context. So how is it going to be applied in cases, implemented in cases where we have informal settlements? I mean, I'm fine in my middle class neighborhood to be in lockdown, to social distance, but in many parts of Africa and many towns in Africa where we do have informal settlements, I mean, that is just virtually not possible. I mean, your question on the financing from the Bretton Woods institutions is certainly a complex one. I mean, we entered this lockdown knowing that the main sources of access to finance was going to come from the World Bank and the IMF, whether it was going to be balance of payment support in the case of the IMF, or emergency funding and different types of packages that the World Bank was going to put together. Very similar during the 2007-2008 financial crisis. I mean, certainly the case in the type of support that was provided during the Ebola crisis to the 3 countries. I think we need to view that financing in the way that it is intended, and that is emergency financing. Its immediate effect, its medium-term effect and long-term effect, I think does need to be viewed very differently, in the sense that the immediate effect is about saving lives. It is about responding not only to your ability to deal with the public health issues, but also to deal with the economic fallout. So the issue around food security, for instance, the issue around an increase in unemployment, that's all part of the package of things that governments need to provide for. And the emergency financing from the World Bank and the IMF certainly plays a critical part in governments being able to do precisely that. Not just buying the PPEs, but also introducing new social protection measures, ensuring that there is food security, etc. And that is about the immediate. Let's talk again about how we tackle some of the medium to long-term effects of those loans that governments have to take.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Neil. Nihretu, you wanted to
Yes.
mention?
So just to quickly add on what Neil said, I think the question that was raised by Stefan is, I think, important. For me, the most important response to community level, health transmission issue would be education. It's true that, in most African countries, we all live in community, and there is really intimate social interaction. And I think it's very critical for the governments to take advantage of community level health extension workers to keep educating the public. I think that would be an important element to the solution. The second thing is what we discussed earlier, which is to take additional public health measures, including testing and tracing, and also encouraging the public to do basic public basic hygiene measures, including masks and others. So I think that would be an important part of the response from the government side. But in addition to that, when we tell people to social distance, and when we encourage people to stay at home, then the government also needs to provide additional support and safety net measures. What we did in Ethiopia is to expand significantly the urban social safety net program to be able to include a large part of the urban poor. And the government that program is an existing program, but as a result of the COVID pandemic, we significantly scaled it up. And through that program, government provide cash and also food to the most vulnerable member of society in most urban areas in the country. So this we are currently doing. Stefan, you also asked a very important question, which is has to do with digital payment. And I think one important consequence of this pandemic is an accelerated adoption of technology. And because of this pandemic, we are currently doing additional work to encourage digital finance. So we are asking banks to adopt the digital payment in collaboration with the telecom companies. And for me, this would be an important area where renewed effort would go into in this post-pandemic world. But this is really a big area that requires further discussion at a later point. But at this point, this is what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to be moving on, but I want you to, I just want to tell you that Stephen is mainly, or the person most responsible for the establishment of the digital PESA, what's the name? Yeah, right. That was really very popular and deployed in Kenya and has spread around. Stephen, on another occasion, we will have to get you here to talk more about that, and where we are tackling the question of technology. But we have to wrap up, and I'm going to go to Stephanie, that lady in blue at the top of the screen here, and ask her to say some final words. Stephanie, you're muted. Unmute. Unmute. Maura?
Maura, please unmute Stephanie.
I'm trying.
Okay.
Stephanie, can you unmute on your end?
No? Oh, of course. Until Maura gets
sorry about this,
aware of what is happening, I just want to thank, I want to thank the great speakers who we had here today, Mr. Mamo, Nihretu, Neil, Cole, and of course,
ready to go.
Jeffrey Sachs. You were all fantastic, gripping actually in your statements. And I'm sure that our audience learned a lot. We learned a lot. And there's hope. There is hope. There is light at the end of the tunnel, but we actually have to be the ones who illuminate that light at the end of the tunnel.
Okay.
And thank you very much. I also want to thank Ben Dotze and Stephen Mwara, who were our guest panelists today, and of course our long-standing Dr. Nur Hussain, Mr. Dalimadi, Dr. Judy, Stephanie, and a whole bunch of technical people who are behind the scenes at the moment. Thank you all very much, and I'm going to pass now with her comments.
Right. Okay, so in wrapping up the webinar, we want to thank everyone for coming, and just wrapping up all of the things we talked about. The presenters and panelists reconfirmed the latest UNEC prediction that COVID-19 may reduce the continent's expected economic growth from 3.2% to 1.8%. As discussed by the panelists, African governments will face rising deficits and increased pressures on currencies. In the absence of significant fiscal stimulus, the combined impact of these economic, fiscal, and monetary challenges could greatly reduce Africa's GDP in 2020. In general, this includes disruption in global supply chains from Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, as well as lower demand in global markets for a wide range of African imports. Moreover, Africa, as described by Neil, Africa is likely to experience delayed or reduced foreign direct investments as partners from other continents redirect capital locally. With many parts of Europe and the US in lockdown, global production and demands are in a downward spiral. This, as well, we have the impact of international and domestic movements, which are restricted, which result in a drop in oil demand and price, which will then give the continent a $60 billion shortfall on the export of oil. Then we have major commodities such as gold, copper, and cocoa, we're also expected to face some level of price drops. The panelists reflected on the impact of the reducing revenue that governments would have and widening the deficit, and also with the lockdown, the decrease in urban consumption and expenditure, where people are not spending as much on manufactured things, transport, and so on. So with those restrictions, that widens the gap. COVID-19 also has a significant impact, as described by Professor Sachs, on the already strained health system, and it's producing an emergency. So we have to then, as described by Dr. Sachs, enhance the healthcare infrastructure and also look at the use of traditional workers. Also, with this widening gap in deficits, it's a time when we need those public finances urgently to meet increased social and health expenditure. As described, Africa's poorest residents are already impacted by food security before the pandemic. As described by Mamo, many of the, and also by Stephen, many of the residents live in the informal sector, and some cannot afford to stay at home even for a day. The governments have limited fiscal space to support the poor, even in the best of times. And in addition, as indicated by the speakers, prolonged stay at home does not enable people to purchase and get things delivered as in other countries. Another important impact that was mentioned, closure of universities will impact human capital, and the closure of schools disproportionately also will affect girls, many of whom will not return to school. So we shared a lot. So we have to build on a structural component to reduce dependence on external financial flow and global markets. We have to develop value-added knowledge, intensive and industrialized economy underpinned by more competitive and efficient sector. And we need to have stronger value chains. Mentioned as well by the panelists is looking at how we can look at models from Vietnam, what precautions, the issues of face masks being identified as needed to be provided, having good leadership and good public health. And moving forward, what do? We invest in preparedness, early detection mechanisms, deploy emergency measures in all sectors, including the informal sectors. As mentioned also, the African Continental Free Trade Area was an opportunity. It has been delayed somewhat, but we can still continue to plan for some of those metrics that were indicated in that. Health, economic, and political shocks will continue. However, what we need to do is to not have it erode the hard work and achievements, is to diversify both production and exports. So in summary, moving forward, we need to protect workforces, we need to secure food supplies and essential services, ensure the support for vulnerable populations, stabilize supply chains, design and implement new Pan-African initiatives, and coordinating is required through all sectors to generate. This COVID-19 has generated an unprecedented opportunity for solidarity to build a stronger continent. This gives us the challenge to make sure we can bring a stronger continent where Africa rise healthier and stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I like the idea, Africa rise healthier and stronger. Now, 1 second. I'm giving each person 15 seconds to make final comments. And I'm starting at the top of the screen, Dr. Judy.
Yes, I appreciate what everyone has said and want to actually underscore what you mentioned before about well-being and connect this to the Sustainable Development Goals, since sustainable development is the topic that we're talking about, that not only do we think about the paradigm of economics, but think about a new paradigm of the people's well-being being included in that.
Thank you, Judy. Ben.
Africa must unite right away in our lifetime. We have a lot to gain. We have nothing to lose. We need to unite. And many of these challenges, I believe, as an Nkrumahist, as a Pan-Africanist, many of the challenges that will come with unity can dissolve easily because there will be strength in unity. Africa must unite.
Thank you, Ben. Something just struck me. You have the tone and tempo of Madiba. Your point.
my family is already teasing me that I'm carrying a bit of his hair. So okay. I'm flattered and humbled. Thank you.
Wow. That's
Dr. Nihretu. Now you're unmute. Unmute.
Okay. I think Ben said it for me. Africa must unite. As a matter of fact, United African Congress wrote a letter to the African Union Commission before the coronavirus struck that it's most likely going to be affected. At that time it wasn't. And Africa can only, prevent this by a united action. Yeah. African Union-led action, not individual countries.
Yeah.
And I think we still hold that position, and I think we are coming to that kind of understanding. The fact that for example, after 50, 60 years after Nkrumah said those words, now we are inter-African, for example, trade is extremely low. So a faster integration of Africa is absolutely necessary, whether it's economic, whether it's doing the health challenges. I think Africa must unite, and I just like to take the opportunity to thank Mr. Mamo Alemu and all the other participants for the wonderful presentation, very lucid and comprehensive. Thank you so very much for being part of this wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Milton.
Yes, I echo what. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yes, I echo what everybody said. As a strong Pan-Africanist as well, and I agree with what you said about Ben. You forgot to compliment his shirt, which is also similar to Madiba's shirt. I think, yeah, I think he's right. African unity would help us on many levels. The debt, dealing with the debt cancellation, for example. I think if everybody has on the same page with Ethiopia, the prospects are good, as Professor Sachs said. In terms of economic empowerment, the Africa Free Trade Area had already been initiated. Of course, there's going to be some disruption from COVID. Once that gets back into track, I think that has tremendous potential in spurring some level of industrially integrated economic systems in African countries. I'm very glad that our comrade Stephen Mwaura was on the show today, because he's shown what technology, digital technology, can do in Kenya. I think Stephen is well positioned to spread that knowledge throughout Africa. And I'm glad our comrade Nihretu responded very positively to Stephen's question about digital technology in helping to spur growth in Africa as well. And I'm very also happy that I think Gordon pointed out Africa earlier. Ethiopia was at another level at one point. Look where Ethiopia is today. Even with the crisis it's facing today, Ethiopia is leap years ahead of where it used to be. And as Ben said, it's really inspiring other African countries. So that is my wrap up. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Milton. Stephen.
Yes, please.
You have your 20 seconds. Go ahead.
We have said so much about Africa. I want to say about Africa, and indeed the whole world must innovate. We have to innovate on how we are going to support the urban poor. We have to innovate on how we are going to avoid locking them down, but more so look for ways of employing them, and also making sure that they do not become the centers of spreading and growth of COVID-19. And finally, we have to innovate and stop investing in military equipment and divest that so that we can fight the public health of the pandemics that are going to be as disturbing as COVID-19 has been. Divest from military, invest in fighting COVID. Thank you.
Thank you for that last comment. I think that last comment deserves a webinar in itself. Thank you, Steve.
Right on.
Yeah, definitely. Stephanie, I know you just had a 5-minute presentation. Do you have some final words? Go ahead.
I think there's so much resources and in Africa that unification and working together with digitalization and education, I think we'll be gone clear. We'll be ahead of the game.
Fantastic. Okay. Mamo.
I want to say one sentence to point out to everyone. Neil, on your wall is a sign, Neil, that says love and dream. It is a wonderful message for today. Why is it there?
He will respond after Mamo speaks. Mamo.
I want to say that Ethiopia is a proud founder of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is the first free trade agreement that we ever ratified in our history. And this is consistent with Ethiopia's Pan-Africanist foreign policy priority that we historically advocated. So we are proud founding member of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I would also say, because about COVID, please make no mistake, an effective public health plan to beat the pandemic is the ultimate answer to how we get our economy back on track. So we should stop thinking of the health and economic response as separate. They are not. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, Neil, you should use some time to respond to Dr. Judy's comments on what you have on your wall.
I'm going to say ditto to all the points that have been made in this final comments. I certainly agree with all of them. So let me use the opportunity to speak about my my posters here at the back. It's to give my boys positive messages every day as reminders. And when I came onto this remote platform and I knew there was going to be lots of webinars and Zoom calls, I also wanted to remind the audience out there that what matters is to love with all our hearts forever.
Wow, what a
Well noted.
wonderful message.
Well,
What a wonderful message. Really, okay. Well, that leaves it up to me. I have enjoyed this webinar. Like the speakers were all fantastic. I believe Africa must unite. And the United States of Africa, which was something that has been in the air or put on the table several years now, and which has not materialized, it is something that we should work towards. Debt cancellation, I think, you know, it's a must if we are all going to get out of this quagmire. If we're going to be able to rebuild the economies, we must have debt cancellation. No question about that. And again, I want to say thank you all for being on this program, and we're looking forward to seeing you again in the future. And Stephen, you're going to inspire us to do some a technology program. But until we do that, thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You've been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All righty. Okay.